working to connect a region of over 600 million bridges between our lands.
Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching ASEAN and Focus on tonight's headlines. President Joe Biden will welcome Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos to the White House on May 1 in a sign of a warming bond between the two nations amid U.S. tensions with China over Taiwan. Foreign Minister Qin Gang warned that criticizing China over Taiwan will have dangerous consequences, as he insisted Beijing is a growing force for peace and justice. And the government is now working to further bring down high inflation and ensure a social protection floor, or SPF framework, will be in place to minimize the economic impact of El Nino, which is expected to severely affect the country by the last quarter of this year. Plus, later, the INC Unity Games commenced in Thailand. President Joe Biden will welcome Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos to the White House on May 1st in a sign of a warming bond between the two nations amid U.S. tensions with China over Taiwan. The White House announcement comes a week after the largest ever joint U.S.-Philippine military exercises in the disputed South China Sea in the face of China's growing assertiveness in the region, particularly over Taiwan, the self-governing island it claims as its own. Last week, the U.S. Secretaries of Defense and State met with their Philippine counterparts in Washington in a high-level summit days after the U.S. gained greater military access in the Philippines. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warned of a troubling increase in coercion and dangerous operational behavior in the South China Sea, an apparent reference to a three-day Chinese military exercise that simulated a blockade and targeted strikes against Taiwan. The White House statement said Biden and Marcos would discuss other matters, including economic cooperation, clean energy, and respect for human rights. The two leaders will also discuss regional matters and coordinate on efforts to uphold international law and promote a free and open Indo-Pacific, according to the statement. Manila earlier this month announced the locations of 4 more military bases it's allowing the U.S. military to use on top of the 5 agreed on under the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, known as EDCA. The deal allows U.S. troops to rotate through and store defense equipment and supplies. China warned last week the expanded military deal could endanger regional peace and accused Washington of a zero-sum mentality. The 4 additional bases include sites near the hotly disputed South China Sea and another not far from Taiwan. Marcos said China's reaction over the expanded military deal was not surprising, but he assured them the Philippines is only shoring up its territorial defense. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang warned that criticizing China over Taiwan will have dangerous consequences, as he insisted Beijing is a growing force for peace and justice. 2 weeks ago, China launched 3 days of military exercises around Taiwan, simulating targeted strikes and a blockade of the island in response to a meeting between Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen and U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Take a look.
Recently, there have been some absurd rhetoric accusing China of challenging the so-called rules-based international order, of unilaterally changing the status quo across the Taiwan Strait through force or coercion, and of disrupting peace and stability across the strait. Such claims go against basic common sense on international relations and historical justice. The logic is absurd and the consequences dangerous. Having suffered among the heaviest casualties in the World Anti-Fascist Alliance during World War II, and as a founding member of the UN and the first country to sign the UN Charter, China sees it as its solemn duty to defend the authority of the UN and uphold the post-war international order. We have the best record in abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, international law, and the basic norms of international relations. We need no reminder by certain countries or groups of countries. Fair-minded people can see full well who is exploiting and discarding the UN at its own will, who is disrupting the international order, and who is engaged in hegemonic, bullying, and high-handed practices.
Now, he also said that both sides of the Taiwan Strait belong to China and that it's right and proper for China to uphold its sovereignty.
Friends, Taiwan has been an inalienable part of China's territory since ancient times, and both sides of the strait belong to one and the same China. This is Taiwan's history, and it is also the status quo of Taiwan. Taiwan's return to China is a component of the post-war international order, written in black and white in the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation. It is right and proper for China to uphold its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We would like to make it clear to those who seek to sabotage international justice in the name of international order. The Taiwan question is the core of the core interests of China, and there will be no vagueness at all in our response to anyone who attempts to distort the One China principle. We will never back down in face of any act that undermines China's sovereignty and security. Those who play with fire on Taiwan will eventually get themselves burned.
Chin will visit the Philippines later, a week after the largest ever joint U.S.-Philippine military exercises in the South China Sea, another area of territorial dispute for Beijing. In other news, 2 measures aimed at achieving deep social and economic change have been approved by the National Economic and Development Authority Board, chaired by President Marcos Jr. Let's listen in.
During its 5th meeting today, the NEDA board, chaired by President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., approved 2 landmark measures that will advance our efforts toward achieving deep social and economic change, leading to a prosperous, inclusive, and resilient Philippines. The first one was the approval of the EO, Executive Order, operationalizing the Philippines tariff commitment under the RCEP agreement. The second measure is the approval of the recommendation for the Social Protection Floor, or SPF. The Social Protection Floor, or SPF, refers to nationally defined set of basic social security guarantees that aim to prevent or alleviate poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. We'll harness the framework to attain desired social objectives, such as protecting the purchasing power of Filipino families and mitigating the harmful, scarring effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially on vulnerable segments of our population. The SPF consists of 4 basic guarantees that cover the entire life cycle. 1, health, including maternity care. 2, children. 3, active age. And 4, older persons. Let me emphasize that today's approval of the government's social protection floor is a significant progress in our country's development history. This is a manifestation of the government's commitment to significantly reduce poverty incidence and promote inclusive growth.
The EO is proposed to be effective on the 2nd of June 2023 to coincide with the end of the 60-day period after the deposit of the instrument of ratification. Once issued, the EO shall be the basis of the Bureau of Customs for the issuance of Customs Administrative Order, which shall be distributed to all ports to allow for the implementation of the preferential tariffs on imports from RCEP member countries. Essentially, the EO will maintain current preferential tariffs on about 98.1% of the 1,718 agricultural tariff lines and 82.7% of the 8,102 industrial tariff lines. Out of the 1,685 agricultural tariff lines retained at current rates, 1,426 tariff lines are maintained at 0, while 154 tariff lines will remain in their respective most favored MFN rates, or most favored nation rates, and excluded from any tariff concession. Meanwhile, agricultural tariffs on 105 lines, which are in the sensitive and highly sensitive list, shall generally be lower than MFN rates in the 20th year of RCEP, but still higher or at par with the ASEAN +1 rates. So, in other words, there is really not going below the ASEAN +1 rates, to which the Philippines is already committed. For the remaining 33 lines, these are the important 33 lines, the EO will reduce tariff rates upon entry into force or implement gradual reduction over a period of 15 to 20 years. But the added advantage of RCEP is that we were able to gain concessions for countries that are the +1 of ASEAN. Like, for example, with China, we have been able to get tariff concessions or lower tariffs for preserved pineapples, pineapple juice, coconut juice, adhesive tape, printed paper, light signal, sound signaling, ignition, wiring, plexographic plate, and from Japan, fish fillet, pineapple, cooked coffee, sunflower seed, canned salmon, chocolate, fruit cocktail, fruit juices, leather gloves, and footwear. From Korea, we'll get concessions, a lower preferential tariff for dried and salted tilapia, cheddar cheese.
The government is now working to further bring down high inflation and ensure a social protection floor or SPF framework that will be in place to minimize the economic impact of El Nino, which is expected to severely affect the country by the last quarter of this year. In a press conference in Malacanang, NEDA Director General Arsenio Balisacan also stressed the importance of keeping inflation in check before the arrival of El Nino, which will cut agricultural production, leading to higher prices for basic goods.
With the inflation, the elevated inflation that we have now, and if you are unable to reduce that inflation, and then you get this El Nino phenomenon, that is a dangerous combination when we want to prevent that from happening.
He asserted that institutionalizing an SPF would reduce these risks for the most vulnerable.
The intention is to institutionalize the existing programs, especially those that have been proven to work, so that we don't have to restart all over again when there are need to provide support to vulnerable groups. No? You know, we are a country that are exposed to a lot of risk. Particularly now we have climate change risk, and we want to make sure that when these vulnerable members of our society are exposed to this risk, that do not fall to poverty, because of those exposures, no? So that we can sustain the progress we are making in poverty reduction.
Currently, he said the country has already brought inflation to a downward trajectory, and he's urging the government, all government agencies, to put in place all measures to mitigate the impact of El Nino this year, using their existing resources under the 2023 national budget.
Actively monitoring the situation and implementing the necessary measures to ensure that by the end of the year, we should be in our target of roughly around 4%, 3.5 to 4%. So we are on that downward trajectory already.
On Monday, the Pagasa said that the country is expected to suffer the worst effects of El Nino during the last quarter of this year. or the first quarter of 2024. The government is now bracing for the possible worst impact. OECD Administrator Ariel Nepomuceno said among the president's instructions was to fast-track the construction of infrastructures projects to increase water storage capacity in high-risk areas.
Karba po natin tubig. 450 plus yung sinabi kanina ng DENR. Subalit, ang gusto ng Pangulo, tingnan kung alin yung dapat bigyan ng priority. Dahil binigay ng pag-asa kung ano yung mga mas posibleng, mas may malalang epekto kagad, namely Bataan, Cavite, and Ilocos, no? Ilocos Norte yata. So, unahin yung mga mas delikado na dun sa 450 plus projects na funded naman according to the DNR. So, particular dun sa tanong kung ano yung pwedeng paghanda naman sa Metro Manila, there are issues on sharing of water resources. So sa ngayon, ongoing yung pag-uusap, and it was committed during the meeting this morning na ibig sabihin yung 40 cubic meter ba? I might not be correct with the figure. Additional supply of water from one concession to another, kailangan magtulungan po yun para yung kulang na concession makakuha din sa kabilang concessionaire.
National Irrigation Administration Acting Administrator Eduardo Guillen said they're proposing the construction of high dams which can be used both to address floods and store water for droughts.
But again, sa long term, dapat talaga high dams. Because when you have high dams, hindi lamang yung El Nino ang pinaprevent mo, pati La Nina. Kasi mga flood control projects po ito. Again, ulitin ko, no, po, the best flood control project is water management. Yun po yung pagkukonstruct ng mga dams. Kung meron po tayong series of dams sa ating mga major and principal river basins, wala tayong problema hindi masyadong problema pagbaha at wala tayong problema pagdating sa El Nino. So, ito yung sinasabi ng Pangulo na long-term solution po.
Pag-asa Deputy Administrator Esperanza Cayan said they have already taken into consideration the worst-case scenario in their evidence-based El Nino preparations.
Ang makakita natin ngayon ay may bagong release po kasi just yesterday afternoon na bagong forecast na tumataas na po yung probability of occurrence ng El Nino. Tumaas na po ito into 80% this coming June, July, August, and the probability increased to about 86% for the month of November, December, and January. So from El Nino Watch, by next month, May, we will be issuing the second level, which is El Nino Alert, kung saan meron po tayong above 70% of probability of El Nino occurrence for the next 2 months.
In tonight's other news, Cambodian leader Hun Sen's eldest son was officially promoted to the rank of 4-star general in another sign of plans for him to succeed his father. Hun Sen has publicly backed Hun Manet to lead the kingdom in the future. Hun Manet, who is commander of the army, received the 4-star rank at a ceremony attended by more than 1,000 senior military officials. Hun Manet, who was educated in Britain and the U.S., has been officially backed by the ruling party as a future prime minister and has been active on social media in recent months to increase his public profile. The 45-year-old has also had more diplomatic meetings with senior political figures than before, according to the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index. He will run for a parliamentary seat when Cambodia goes to the polls in July this year, according to a party document seen by AFP. Hun Sen, who has ruled the country for 38 years, has repeatedly hinted at stepping down but has said he will run for office again in the coming election. In other news beyond the region, violent weather exacted a heartbreaking toll this spring, the rate of tornado deaths in the U.S. rapidly outpacing last year. And now another state reeling in the aftermath of a deadly strike. People in McLean County, Oklahoma found themselves in the literal part of disaster as a massive funnel cloud bore down on them. At least 3 people died in what the Weather Service have classified an EF tornado. The National Weather Service office in nearby Norman, Oklahoma, described erratic tornadoes and supercell storms in the region. It left people trapped, ripped apart homes and businesses, and took out power for thousands. The Oklahoma fatalities, bringing to 66 this year, close to surpassing the 71-day C as average. The McLean County Sheriff's Office said Thursday evening that everyone is believed to have been accounted for following the storm. In other news, the IMF says Asia and the Pacific remains a dynamic region despite the somber backdrop of what looks to be shaping up as a challenging year for the world economy. Take a look.
Going beyond China. Now, what does this mean? What does China's growth rebound mean for Asia Pacific? Here we have projected our growth for Asia Pacific to be 4.6% in 2023. This is a 0.3 percentage point higher than we expected last October. The ASEAN economies are expected to see growth decreasing from 5.7% in 2022 to 4.6% in 2023 due to a slight moderation in domestic demand momentum, monetary tightening, lower commodity prices, and weaker external demand from the US and Europe. Now, despite the solid growth outlook for Asia Pacific, policymakers in the region cannot be complacent. The region is still facing 4 significant policy challenges. What are those? Inflation. Inflation in the region is still above target. Core inflation remains sticky and has become a more important driver of headline inflation recently, which may lead to more persistent inflation and wage pressure. Output gaps for Asian economies are either closing or are already closed, and currency depreciation last year is still passing through to domestic prices. These factors suggest that the battle to contain inflation is not yet over, and yet monetary tightening has slowed down or paused in most countries in the region. Given the substantial inflation risk, we think monetary policy in the region may need to stay tighter for longer.
Now, what do these challenges mean for policymakers?
So as Asia faces these important challenges, we advise policymakers to stay vigilant. Policymakers should keep a close eye for financial stress and develop contingency plans. Unless strains increase and raise broad stability concerns, central banks should separate monetary policy objectives from financial stability goals. To do so, they should use available tools such as lending and discount facilities to ease any liquidity constraints in the banking sector, allowing them to keep policy rates tighter for longer until inflation falls durably back to target. In addition, fiscal consolidation may need to be more aggressive to ensure sustainability over the medium term. Policymakers must strike a balance between supporting growth, protecting the vulnerable, and addressing debt concerns. And finally, Asian economies must also prioritize policy initiatives that foster long-term growth. Structural reforms are needed to boost innovation and digitalization, accelerate the green transition, energy transition, and reduce risks from fragmentation and ensure food security.
The Philippine Central Bank Governor Felipe Medalla said he wished the U.S. Federal Reserve would be more caring about international conditions when it raises interest rates. Medalla made the comment at a talk held by the IMF and the World Bank. Let's listen in.
We let the market move the exchange rate, which is the textbook. The other one is we raise policy rate, which again is the textbook. Mm-hmm. The other one is we thought that we have to intervene because the exchange rate was moving too much because of U.S. monetary policy. Mm-hmm. So what happened was we ended up increasing policy rates from 200 to 625. But this exaggerates the movement because the 200 was quite abnormal to begin with. Because the normal policy rate in the Philippines is more like 3.5. But because of the COVID, we brought it down to 200. The banks took a loss in their holdings of government securities, but the profits increased because of the higher lending rate. Mm-hmm. So by and large, the banks are very stable.
Now, the governor noted the Philippine economy had also been affected by the Fed's quantitative easing during the global financial crisis, with the peso rising sharply against the dollar and many firms going bankrupt. He said the key to prepare for any external shocks is to have a large foreign reserve.
So I think in summary, if you use all your weapons, your primary weapon for inflation can be used to their full potential, and because the primary weapon is still interest rates, but this must be supported by good prudential regulation, and and buffers because foreign exchange markets can go crazy, and then the currency issue of the world is driven by what happens to Iowa, and in very domestic concerns. Clearly, the policy rates in the U.S. They don't care what happens to the world in general, and they're very targeted to happen in the U.S. You have to be ready, and therefore having buffers very important.
He also said the impact of the 1987 Asian financial crisis continued to influence attitudes to risk in Asia, which partly explains prudent management. And the first hybrid solar eclipse in a decade didn't disappoint. At 9:36 p.m. EDT on April 19, the rare hybrid solar eclipse swept over the Pacific, with the moon's shadow passing over Western Australia, East Timor, and Indonesia. A hybrid eclipse is a type of solar eclipse that looks either like an annular solar eclipse when the moon covers only the center of the sun, or a total solar eclipse when the moon covers the sun in its entirety. Such celestial events happen once every decade. The last one was in 2013, and the next one isn't until 2031, and they occur when Earth is in the sweet spot, so the moon and the sun are almost the exact same size in the sky, according to NASA solar expert Michael Kirk. Only 7 of this type of eclipse will occur in the entire 21st century.
5 segundos. Ida, remata. Tengo un faloclo.
Fenomena jarang tebes acontece e atrai tebes turista lokal, internasional, namo cientista lokal no internasional sira atau bele participa ho de bele halo monitorização hamutu bahia evento refere.
Actually, our honeymoon trip was to Thailand, and we got married in August, and we shifted our honeymoon trip to October to see the eclipse.
You love eclipses so much, you pushed back your honeymoon.
Yes, and my wife says, okay, if he's happy, I'm happy too. Happy wife, happy life. So.
And the Philippines will send a 259-member delegation, including 174 athletes, to the 12th ASEAN Para Games scheduled on June 3 to the 9th in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Take a look. Philippine Sports Commission Commissioner and Team Philippines Chef de Mission Walter Torres will submit the names of athletes, coaches, team officials, and administrative staff when he attends the delegation registration meeting on May 28. The Filipino para-athletes will compete in 13 sports, namely athletics, badminton, boccia, chess, cerebral palsy football, goalball, judo, powerlifting, sitting, volleyball, swimming, table tennis, wheelchair basketball, and demonstration sport, esports. The PSC, in coordination with the Philippine Paralympic Committee, will host a send-off party for the Cambodia-bound delegates on May 21 at the Multipurpose Arena in Pasig City. Torres is optimistic that the national para-athletes will perform well in the June 3 to 9 tournament. Aside from unity and inspiration, the INC Unity Games in Thailand brought the much-needed boost to mind and body. As the people there held their first Unity Games for this year, our ASEAN Bureau in Thailand, Nicole Regalado, reports from Bangkok.
In unity, there is strength. Aesop said, "It is indeed true that ties were strengthened, love widened, and smiles were shared in the Unity Games held in Rangsit, Thailand." Iglesia Ni Cristo members from various places of the country participated in multiple sports competition to show teamwork and cooperation. The program started with a prayer followed by a parade. Members and ministers are alike showcased their dribbling and shooting skills through a basketball exhibition. The volleyball match, men and women division, were held after players demonstrated their quick wits and talents in serving and spiking. The final sport held in the afternoon were the badminton matches, wherein players had displayed agility and speed in the court. At the end of the day, the winning teams were awarded in their hard-earned trophies and medals. The activity ended with a prayer.
Ang isa po sa nagtulak sa mga kapatid na makipagkaisa po sa ganitong aktibidad ay upang manatili po yung maayos na kalusugan at lagi na po ay magkaroon ng exercise. At unang-unang at higit po sa lahat, ang layunin po ng bawat isa sa pakikilahok po sa ganitong aktibidad ay para po makipagkaisa sa mga aktibidad na inilulunsad po ng pamamahala.
After a long busy month, brethren set their time for this activity that we're holding in the district. And we feel that the brethren are so eager and have the desire to participate in our games. Not only to participate in the Unity Games, they long to unite with the church administration in all the activities that the church administration launches in the church. And the brethren here in the District of Thailand are always and remain united with this aim and desire of our beloved Executive Minister, Brother Eduardo B. Manalo. To our beloved Executive Minister, we will continue and remain to unite with you po in all the holy endeavors of the church, especially in the missionary work and also in edifying the brethren and in all the activities that you launches in the church. We love you so much po.
The participants left with wide smiles on their faces. They know that they gained closeness, brotherhood, and newfound friendships that would add more happiness and enrichment in their lives. Reporting from Rangsit, Thailand, I am Nicole Regalado. We live in extraordinary times.
As my usual habit, I'd like to end the day on a positive note. Let's encourage and build each other up so that no one is left behind. And that's it for tonight's broadcast. I'm Alma Angeles. Stay in the news because we live in extraordinary times. Good night.